Oops. So it's working?
Yes.
Yeah.
Looks great.
Yes.
Okay, so I will stop sharing then. Very good.
Thank you. Is there anyone else?
You're still waiting for Professor Douglas Anna. And then I think we're all set.
Regina, we're waiting for Mr. Haksar and Professor Ardner as well, right?
Yes, and I think you can give the housekeeping notes 5 minutes early, and then we'll give the floor to Professor Wei Shangjing at 9:30
Yes.
sharp, because Professor Catalyst, he has something else to do after his speech. So we start at
Okay.
9:30. Okay.
Perfect. So I guess I assume the other presenters that are going to show up, we're just not going to be able to test out their screen sharing function, right? I think it should be fine. Regina, I did want to test out Professor Chen's screen share functions, but it seems like he's not in with us yet.
He's coming.
Hi, Professor Duffy.
Hey,
I just
good
want to make
morning.
sure you don't have any slides to share with us today, right?
I could show a few, but I don't need to.
Okay, cool. I just asking, so we want to know if you want to test out your screen sharing function or not.
I mean, let's test it, but I've done it so many times. I hope it doesn't.
Yeah. I assume, yeah.
Morning, Daryl.
Good morning.
Very early morning to you. Xiangjin Wei here. Sorry.
Good to see you.
To see you.
One
Hi,
moment.
Daryl.
Ah,
Hi,
Xavier.
Xavier.
Hi, how are
Here.
you? Yeah,
Is it afternoon for you, Xavier?
for me, it's afternoon. Yes, 3:30, almost. Yeah.
Perfect.
I'll just do a full screen. Now you get the
Great.
theme of my remarks as well.
Yeah, it looks great. Thank you.
There you go.
Mars, Professor Chen is here. You want to cast the
Okay.
screenshot?
Professor Chen, can you hear me?
I'm still working on my earphone. Wait a second.
Okay. I see Professor Arner is also here.
Hello, Professor Anna. How are you?
Good. Hey, Regina. Nice to put a face with the email.
Do you want to test your screen share function now? Yeah, I saw your slides.
Sure. It'll be
Thank
my
you.
third time today, so might as well see if it works still.
Yes, it did right.
Hi, Regina. I just want to say hi to you also.
Hello, Professor Wei.
Others at the Luohan Tang colleagues.
Mars. Nice to meet you, Professor Wei.
Nice to meet you. Are you all in Hangzhou right now or somewhere else?
Most of us are in Hangzhou. I'm actually in Beijing right now.
In Beijing. Same
But
time
same
zone.
time zone still. Yeah, exactly. Same time zone. I guess we'll let Professor Arner test it out. We don't even have to, actually. I'm pretty sure it works for him. Just good to be safe.
Yeah. All right.
Do you want to give the housekeeping notes?
Yeah,
while we
I would do that.
Mm.
Looks perfect. Thank you. Good morning, US time zones. Good afternoon, Asian time zones. And hello to everyone in between. Welcome to Frontier Dialogue. This is the fifth one we've done in the series at Luohan Academy, where we bring together prominent thinkers, academics, and leaders from the private sector, and has truly been a rewarding and constructive journey. It is our genuine honor and pleasure to have such a distinguished list of panelists and discussants here with us today. Now, before I introduce our moderator, I just have a few housekeeping notes. First, since we do have a pretty full house of audience today, we encourage you to fully utilize the chat box function to document your questions during the speaker's presentation. It will also help us to facilitate the discussion period in session 2. Second, we do have some interpreters on the Zoom call with us today. So while the dialogue is held in English, please feel free to use the interpretation function at the bottom of the Zoom window if need be. Third, this is a closed door academic meeting. We kindly ask you to not share any content. We kindly ask you to not share the content shared here today by the panelists and discussants with anyone else. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our moderator, Professor Xiangjin Wei. Thank you, Professor Wei.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. That's the greeting of the digital age. Digitization has changed our life, our work, and certainly our finance. It's always, since this is a unfinished revolution, it's good to always stop from time to time to reflect on well, how far we have traveled, why we have taken the routes we have, and what the future might look like. With us is a group of very distinguished researchers, practitioners, deep thinkers, and innovators. So our program is organized by our fearless leader, Chen Long. consists of first a set of 5 speakers featuring a lead speaker for 15 minutes and a discussant for 5 to 7 minutes, and then after that we'll have open floor discussion, and going to and towards the end we're going to invite Professor Lars Hansen to reflect to share his reflection on the subject. So without further ado, let me turn to our first lead speaker, Christian Catalini, to share his view on fintech and financial service provision, please. Christian, please.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I'd like to kind of give a quick overview on some of the ideas that we've been working on through the DM journey. I mean, this is a space that over the last few years has seen an explosion in interest and in activity. When we designed the MIT digital currency experiment, this was in 13, 14. As you can see on this map, the Google Trends for some of the keywords was kind of flat. It's gone through different waves, and I think in parallel with kind of a rising interest in cryptocurrencies and blockchain, there's also been a rise in interest in CBDCs. I mean, part of this was probably accelerated by the first version of our white paper in the summer of 2020, and kind of the reaction to what I've described as a very naive first version of the DM vision. But taking a step back, I think what's really interesting, and I see Joshua Gans on the call today, my co-author on this piece, is that at its heart, blockchain technology really allows for new forms of market design. This is really driven by a reduction in 2 fundamental costs that the technology reduces. What we call the cost of verification. That one is very intuitive. Essentially, the cost of verifying that digital information is accurate and kind of up to date. And the cost of networking. So for the lack of a better term, we really kind of connect this to the ability to bootstrap a digital ecosystem without assigning control and market power to a centralized intermediary. So maybe a better way to talk about the cost of networking is really about interoperability. These are new types of networks that are highly interoperable, and on top of that can be programmed to perform different functions. I think we've seen this before. Our kind of interoperability has driven a wave of innovation in a number of different services with the internet. But what's happening with cryptocurrencies is that to some extent, this combination of interoperability and programmability is going through a number of different verticals. You have decentralized finance applications, which are essentially taking interoperability to financial markets and allowing a number of digital assets to trade and be exchanged in other forms. You have a similar type of change happening in the creative industries and digital content with NFTs or non-fungible tokens. And all of these are kind of following a very similar narrative of removing intermediaries from the picture or changing more precisely the nature of intermediation in financial services, payments, and of course, also in the digital distribution of content online. Now, one of the challenges with the removal of intermediaries is that, of course, intermediaries play a very important role in society. Often, they're the carriers of society's values and principles. And so in a piece with Zaim Assari from Davis Polk, for example, we highlight how DeFi will need to reconcile some of the capabilities of the technology with the ability to regulate markets, ensure that insiders don't exploit information that they have access to or try to manipulate the market to their own advantage. A number of protections that we come to enjoy in traditional financial systems, but haven't been ported back in the cryptocurrencies and blockchain space. At its core, you may think that this is a technology, it's just another instance of software eating the world, but really there's a crucial interplay here between code, software, and complementary institutions coming and kind of allowing the technology to really reach its full potential. Now, there's a number of key long-term benefits of the technology. I've already stressed kind of higher interoperability. That also often comes with lower barriers to entry and the ability of kind of really reducing switching costs and lock-in for different market participants. At its core, it's a technology that allows you to unbundle products and financial services that are currently bundled together in institutions such as banks. And also has a lot of potential on privacy. I think there's a number of new designs that when it comes to privacy, allow you to embed privacy principle from the ground up. It also comes with increased transparency and accountability. That can be a double-edged sword depending on how the technology is implemented. Now, a lot of this has kind of made it into the design of DM. DM, as you may know, is kind of a stable coin. But something, and I don't have enough time to go into the details here, that's worth highlighting is that stablecoin is a bit of a misnomer. It's come to capture a number of different implementations that have all sort of different risks when it comes to consumers transacting with this type of assets. At a very high level, how stablecoin really kind of tracks what's the relationship between a stablecoin and its reference asset, say the US dollar, whether it's completely not correlated, as in the case of crypto-backed under collateralized stablecoins, or if it's perfect correlated, in which case it's likely to be something that looks a lot like a CBDC issued by the public sector. I think there's a spectrum of how reliable these tools can be in achieving a robust payment and financial system. Now, on the DM front, we've incorporated some of the gold standards from the financial sector. Think about the Basel III framework, and really trying to deliver on a payment tool and a payment network that is highly reliable and can really withstand stress market conditions. But more important is our commitment to really phase out our own coin. Think about a DM dollar the moment there is a public sector supported CBDC. And in that case, essentially DM essentially just becomes a payment system on top of public sector rails. Now, often people ask about the business model. The business model does not rely on interest on the reserve. So there's no point in kind of running the coin in the long run. And in fact, the coin will be replaced again with a public sector asset. It's a transactional network. And so the business model will rely on charging very small transaction fees to its participants. Now, because of programmability, of course, you could imagine slightly higher fees for added value transactions. Think about conditional payments, which, by the way, are a big opportunity for government to citizen cash transfers in situations like the COVID recovery phase. When it comes to the network, we moved away from proof of work. I mean, this has been kind of in the headlines in the last few weeks. A lot of concerns about the environmental impact of proof of work-based networks. The reason actually why we did not choose proof of work beyond the environmental impact was also because proof of work does not really have the right types of incentives for ensuring upgrades in the quality and availability of the service. And so DM is sort of a hybrid network where, to some extent, we're relying on the off-chain reputation of the initial members to run and secure the validator nodes. And this is kind of where the association members come into the picture. They're there to drive utility and also secure the validators. But over time, this is really not designed to be a walled garden. Modeled after the open technology standards of the internet, it forces interoperability between different wallets. So, users from a small wallet will benefit from access to the user base of a larger wallet, with much stronger network effects. The same is happening on the merchant side. So a merchant could choose to switch between different payment service providers and kind of retain all the functionality of a pay with DM flow. The idea is really to drive competition and to use that competitive force to lower prices, new products and services, and really improvements in quality. Now, relative to existing stablecoins, this is really a network that is optimized for payments. And we've made a number of changes from the early version of the white paper to really account for all of that. I won't go into too much detail, but I want to highlight a few kind of key questions. So why build a stablecoin at all? Well, you should think of this as a retrofitting exercise. We have slow, expensive fiat rails or payment systems like the card networks that have a number of legacy costs, including interchange. By retrofitting them with much faster, more efficient, interoperable digital rails, we can really accelerate progress on that dimension and reduce really fragmentation in payments. And then, of course, in the medium term, there's programmability. And so there's a lot more you can do when you add conditional payments, escrow services, and other functionality on top of the network. What are we innovating on is really higher standards for consumer protection, the design of the reserve, and really figuring out a design that does not interfere with macroeconomic policy and financial stability. Some stablecoins today actually talk about dollarization almost as a feature, as one of their use cases. We don't think that that's kind of a sustainable one, and in fact, we want to work together with a number of local governments in trying to find a way for the network to be accessible without threatening currency substitution or other kind of key risk. The other big area of innovation is robust financial crime and compliance standards. This is going to be the first network that not only would implement sanctions at the protocol level, but would also adhere with things like the travel rule and other measures to combat financial crimes. Now, we think of DM very much as a complement to the public sector journey towards CBDCs. Some people have compared it to the collaboration that you've seen, for example, in space between NASA and SpaceX. But if you look even at some of the documents coming out, for example, from the Bank of England, in their discussion paper on central bank digital currency, they really stress that a CBDC without private sector involvement is unlikely to really meet their design principles. And this is something that we also really believe in as a driver of real complementarities between the public sector really building the core infrastructure and then the private sector driving innovation and use cases on top of it. So very high level, what are some of the comparative advantages? Of course, the public sector, monetary policy, providing stability, preserving value. There's no point in having a stable coin if you do have a CBDC token that's clearly superior and provides better consumer protection. If you think of the public sector providing the core settlement layer, then on top of that, very much like the internet, you can have all sort of additional protocols that take advantage of that and really customize that network for different verticals, industry verticals, and different use cases. Now, a really important role for the public sector is also setting rules, again, across those dimensions I was mentioning, like consumer protection, financial stability, competition, market integrity, and also availability of the infrastructure under stress conditions, forcing and really encouraging interoperability between different networks, right? So if you have a CBDC token, can it be used across many different networks that are competing with each other? And on a global perspective, harmonizing legal frameworks. For example, the work by the FSB on global stablecoins has been extremely helpful, I think, in driving some degree of convergence on some of these topics. On the public sector side, this is where really, being able to develop the consumer and business facing products and experiences, it's one where the private sector can move much faster. Experimenting with programmability is also something that probably a CBDC token may have a hard time given the risk involved, and also really accelerating time to market. So again, going back to the picture of the early internet, this is an area where public and private sectors are actually complements. And I think building on the history, countries that are really interested in accelerating their journey, I think should kind of explore these combinations. Given that on the other hand, you do have kind of more permissionless cryptocurrency networks that do not provide some of the same protections and are still growing at a very fast rate. So maybe I'll pause there.
Two more minutes.
Forward to
perfect. Okay, you're
I'm all done.
ahead of time. Great, thank you.
So
all right.
Looking forward to Daryl's comments. Thank you.
Christian, yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. So let's go to Daryl Duffy. Good, very early morning to you, Daryl.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially in front of this group, and especially to have the chance to discuss Christian's work, very important work at DM. He and I have had a lot of conversations about this over the past few years. I want to sharply focus my remarks on one theme because I see a lot of influencers in the audience, and I want to influence them with one question. Why can't banks do this? I'm going to try to make the case banks are perfectly positioned to do this, but they won't. It's not that they can't. And let me get into this. So here's your prototypical payment situation. Alice needs to pay Bob the baker $8. How is she going to do it? Well, for centuries, Alice sent a message to her bank saying, send the $8 out of my account, put it into Bob's account. Now, today, from Alice's point of view, this is working fine. From Bob's point of view, it's not working at all well. He's paying a huge fee and he's getting the money slow. The system is not working well. And there are similar problems on the B2B side, on the cross-border side, and in many other places. This diagram, there's nothing wrong with it. This wiring diagram works perfectly. Alice, if customer 1 of bank 1 can get the money to Bob, who's customer 7 of bank 3, through the current payment rails, in principle, at least according to this diagram, without difficulties and inexpensively. The technology exists today to do that, but it's not happening. Here is evidence of why it's not happening. This is a bit complicated. It's from the McKinsey Global Payments Report, the latest one. It's a series of very useful reports. What I want you to take a look at is first the headline. The cost of payments in the US, as far as the users go, that's payment revenues, is 2.4% of GDP. That is not a small number. And that's in North America. In Europe, Middle East, and Africa, 1.3%. What accounts for that difference? Well, I can assure you it's not that North America has much, much better payments than Europe. It's simply that you're dealing with incentive issues with respect to margins and two-sided markets. So for example, speaking of two-sided markets, let's look at the credit card segment in the US. I'll just spend a little moment on that. 33% of the payment stack in North America is on consumer credit cards, 10% in mostly Europe. Why? Well, because in North America, there's an enormous markup on the use of credit cards. Interchange fees are well above 2%. There's something that's not working right in the US system. Now, I'm going to finish my remarks with my diagnosis of the problem. The main problem is that you have a situation in which the banks are capable technically of doing this, but they don't have the profit incentive to do it. And there are coordination failures. You have walled gardens, which Christian mentioned, and you have a Rocher-Tirol two-sided market situation in which the payment service providers face consumers on one side and merchants on the other, and they have the opportunity to stick it to the merchants in order to profit from them and give the consumers a relatively painless and low-cost experience. Why are central banks in most countries today in deep angst over letting disruption occur in their payment systems? Whether they should let in fintech payment service providers like Alipay and TenPay, let them have central bank accounts, encourage private stablecoins like DM, or go to the nuclear option of introducing CBDCs. Most central banks do not want the responsibility for making these decisions. They do not want the responsibility for protecting data privacy, for doing anti-money laundering, KYC, and they definitely don't want to disrupt banks. They would love to have the banks just take care of this problem. Gosh, I've got so much to say on this. Let me repeat the mantra that central banks keep saying when they say if they design a CBDC, they will do it without disrupting banks. I think that's a misunderstanding. The whole point is to disrupt banks. We need to disrupt banks in order to get proper payment services at reasonable prices. One of the reasons that central banks say they don't want to do this is that if they disrupt banks, then banks will not have a cheap deposit source of funding, and therefore credit provision will go down. Let me repeat that. We're all economists. Do you really think that it makes sense that if banks are subsidized on the deposit side, that they're going to make more loans? If you were at Chase and you had the opportunity to make a losing loan, would you do it because somebody on the deposit side said, go ahead, we're going to make profits over here in payments and deposits. You can go ahead and lose money on the loan side. No, it doesn't make any sense at all. Another reason that central banks say they don't want to do it is that they're worried about creating runs for banks. I think that problem is not as serious a problem as it's made out to be. So we're in this situation now where central banks have to come to grips with this very serious problem. If you read Governor Brainerd's speech this week, the Federal Reserve Governor Lael Brainerd, you'll see that eventually the United States is coming around to the view that it's going to have to disrupt banks and introduce a CBDC if the banks don't do it themselves. The banks have very profitable franchises, and if they don't move quickly, they're going to lose some of those. And I think you will see some movement, but I don't know how to handicap this race. Let me finish by just a couple of remarks on Christian's comments about moving to faster, programmable, smart contract-based payment systems. The banks can do this as well. There's no reason that bank deposits can't be tokenized and made into smart money. Let's be cautious about bifurcating the payment system into several chunks. That's not efficient. There's enormous network externalities, positive network externalities in payments, and having everything run on one set of payment rails or as nearly as possible is actually a much more efficient way to do it. Let's also be cautious about what we do when we make programmable money and smart contract settlement. There's a really good paper by Rob Townsend, Michael Junho Lee, and Antoine Martin that draws some cautions, and I'm actually working on this problem as well. There are unintended consequences of balkanizing payments and settlements by using programmable money and smart contracts. Not that it can't work well, but it needs to be done thoughtfully and carefully. Read Rob's paper. It's also the case that when you split payment networks between private and central bank, private stablecoins, central bank digital currencies, and bank rail payments, that you are increasing the need for pre-funding each of those payment systems with liquidity. And the total amount of high quality liquid assets that need to be held in the form of a payment medium goes up a lot. So let's be cautious about these potential unintended consequences of moving away from a bank rail payment system. Much better would be somehow get the banks to do this, whether through regulation or incentives. But I'm not optimistic that's going to happen. And regulators and central banks need to get ready to come in with their own central bank digital currencies, if necessary, to get movement in this area. So that's the end of my remarks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Both sets of very interesting remarks, I'm sure, have inspired many interesting questions. But the program is designed in such a way that we're going to hear the other 4 sets of remarks first before we go for open discussion. So now let's go to Manju Puri for her thought on fintech and the future of finance, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with this global audience. And I just want to check, you can see my slides fine, or can you see all the notes?
We can see the slides very well.
Okay, excellent. All right, so let me get started on fintech and finance. As you all know, this is a very, very broad topic. It covers a number of wide-ranging areas, and the talks today, are going to be great in that they'll cover many aspects. And in such a broad area, I think my talk is going to focus more on digital footprints and the implications for credit, right? And when we talk about digital footprints, what do we mean? It can mean a number of things, right? So you could have a bare bones digital footprint, which is simply when you go and access the web, how much information do you leave behind? You can have a deep digital footprint where you mine your entire web presence, whether it's the social media or Twitter or information that you have on various forums. And there's a growing industry that is claiming at least to do alternate credit scoring through digital footprints. Now, how informative are digital footprints? How durable? And there's both promise and concerns. There are a number of promises, in particular, access to credit for the unbanked. And there are some concerns, right? There's privacy concerns, discrimination concerns, etc. Right? And so, so what I'm going to start with first is just a bare bones digital footprint. And that is when these days we're pretty aware that when we leave it, if we put something on Twitter or Facebook, it's publicly accessible. And so people have become a little bit more careful as to what they put there. But on a regular basis, all of us go to the web, we access various internet sites, and we register there. How much information does that simple act do, right? And that is accessing and registering on a website. And so that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at this shallow digital footprint, or the bare bones digital footprint. And here's a picture, and this is a publicly available picture sort of New York City. Now, if I was a woman from Mars, right, and I know nothing about the US, let alone New York, what information could I gauge from this picture? I'm sorry?
Manju, your slides are not advancing.
My slides are not advancing?
Yeah.
Oh.
We still see your first slide.
That's not good. Okay, let me take out, I have a second monitor. Now can you see anything? Does it change?
No, we still see the first slide only.
Okay, I'm going to stop share and then reshare again.
It's good now.
Now it's good? Yeah. Okay. So let's look at, here's a picture of New York City. And in this picture, what you can see is the red dots are basically iOS. The green dots are going to be Android, and the purple dots are BlackBerries. And so if you look at this picture, what do you see? So you can see that the red dots are concentrated, if you will, in the city of Manhattan, right? And there's an interesting recent paper which looks at what is the difference between the rich and the poor through the ages. So it used to be, do I have cable TV? Do I have a BMW? In today's world, it's, do I have an iPhone, right? And so you can see here that the wealth is sort of concentrated in Manhattan. Once you start going to New Jersey and Brooklyn, you see a lot more of these green dots. And so, this is where there's less wealth. And in the heart of Manhattan, you see a few purple dots. And what are they? So that's, it's like the Obamas of the world that refuse to give up their BlackBerries, or more likely, it is bank issued sort of BlackBerries, right? And this is simply one piece of information that you get when people access the web. And it's already telling us a lot about, let's say, the wealth distribution in New York City, right? And so the question here is, if we were to look at, just the information that you leave behind, this and a few others, which is a shallow digital footprint, how much can we actually say about default rates, and how well can we assess your credit, right? And so while there are a growing number of companies that do alternate credit scoring, the effectiveness of this is unknown. And so as a researcher and as a journal editor, it is important that we be able to access data and actually research and analyze and quantify this if we're to take this into account in our discourse, in practice, and with regulators. And so we were able to access data from an e-commerce website in Germany, which was very similar to Wayfair, where you browse, you purchase the goods. It could be a desk, a chair, and then you pay for it later. And the default rate is roughly 3% annualized, so very similar to what you would see in other places. So our digital footprint is going to be three sort of easily accessible variables. So the first is simply the device type, right? Do I use a desktop, a tablet, a mobile? Then the operating system is iOS, Android, or Windows. And who is the email provider? And as I said, having an iPhone requires a certain amount of purchasing power. So it's research has shown it's a proxy for being in the top quartile of income. And you have free emails, you have free old emails like Yahoo and Hotmail, and you have free new emails, relatively new, such as Gmail. And you have emails that you pay for, right? Such as AOL, or in Germany, it's T-Online. So again, if you're paying for your email, that probably means you're a little more wealthy, or that you have higher income levels. The next four are looking at the channel through which you get there. Do you actually type in where you want to go, or are you clicking on paid ads, right? And perhaps not surprisingly, certainly to people in marketing, people who click on paid ads, they are much more likely to default. We also look at checkout time. What time of the day do you purchase, morning, noon, or night? And people who do their purchasing between midnight and 6 a.m. are the most likely to default. We look at tracking, we look at email errors. So when you put your email in, does it bounce? And so if you stole the email, or you're so drunk you can't remember your email and it bounces, yes, you actually are more likely to default. We also look at, is your name in the email? There's a growing amount of research in entrepreneurship that suggests putting your name on your company actually matters. And this is what we find. If your first or last name is in the email, you're less likely to default. And then finally, we look at, do you type everything in lowercase, or like civilized people do you actually, capitalize, the first letter of your name, etc. And we find people who type all in lower cases, they are actually more likely to default. And so these are 10 simple variables that you leave behind when you simply access and register on a website. And it turns out it has a lot of predictive power in terms of default rates. And so here's a graph which is looking at the credit bureau score and default rates. And you can see the difference between the first and the last decile of the credit bureau scores is fairly significant. But if I take just two variables from the digital footprint, and that is if I take whether it's Mac and T online, that's a paid email, as opposed to Android and an old free email, the difference in default here is higher than the difference in default between the first and the last decile of the credit bureau score. So it suggests that the digital footprint, even a bare bones digital footprint, can actually be very powerful. We then look at area under the curve, which is a pretty standard way of looking at discriminatory power. And the idea here is you want to see if the lowest 25%, how much of default is that giving you? So if it's completely random, you're going to have this 45-degree line that it's 50-50 whether you default or not. And in general, research suggests that if you have 60% or better, that's sort of a good score. And so, what we find when we look at the area under the curve is if you look at just the credit bureau score, you get a good area under the curve of 66%. But when you look at the digital footprint, the area under the curve is actually almost as good. So it's above 68%. And so, think of all the work and effort that goes into making a credit bureau score, right? All the people, you have to track the credit, the default, late interest payments, etc. And think of the amount of effort it takes to get the digital footprint, right? And very little. And yet, even with the shallow digital footprint, it's doing as well as the credit bureau score. And when you add the two together, it actually does even better, right? And you actually add another sort of 5% of discriminatory power. So which this again, it suggests that the two are complements as opposed to substitutes. You do well adding them together. And here's just a quick comparison with other studies. But the one that I think is most informative, perhaps, is comparing it with the internal credit ratings of banks. So when you look at banks and their internal credit ratings, there's a large literature saying banks are special, they're collecting all this information that they have, a lot of private information, and all that time, energy, and money is doing well. They add, 8 to 12% over a credit bureau score. And so this is good news for banks, but our digital footprint, the bare bones shallow digital footprint, is already doing half as well. And this is without mining for additional information. So clearly this is telling you that banks' competitive advantage is sort of being threatened. And so the idea so far is we looked at the predictive power of the digital footprint for short-term loans for products purchased online. What about for long-term loans, let's say mortgages and all? We don't have data on that, but we can do the next best thing, which is see, does the digital footprint predict your future credit score? And when we do that, we find that is indeed the case. Now that makes sense. What is the credit bureau score? It is your historical sort of analysis of everything that's happened, your defaults in the past. What is the digital footprint? It's encompassing you as you are today. So I might have had a great, credit bureau score, but if I lost my job, fell in depression, started drinking, started getting up at 2 a.m., randomly shopping at night, the digital footprint is going to capture that. It's going to take time to get encompassed into the credit bureau score. And so that's indeed what we see. And so this has a number of implications. So the first is on the information advantage for financial intermediaries like banks. So banks historically, one of their main advantages has been that they have access to all this information about you, from your deposits, from prior lending, etc. And now it looks like the digital footprint pretty costlessly can actually access a lot of this information and can start threatening, banks' traditional sort of information advantage. Now,
Thank
this
you.
of course, yeah.
2 more minutes, please.
Yeah, this raises a number of questions. Can banks use such information? Would regulators allow them? Is this durable? How does this operate through the cycles, right? And so you need, we have a time-honored way of sort of credit scoring by banks. And so the question is, if once we have, would this work well in downturns too? The next implication is access to credit for the unbanked. And here is sort of the hope by many. And in our sample, when we look at people who do not have credit scores, we find the digital footprint actually works as well, if not better, than for people who never had credit scores. And so this gives us hope that we could use the digital footprint to actually give access to credit to those who are non-banked. And then finally, last but not least, there's the implication for consumers, firms, and regulators in the digital sphere. So while on the one hand, you might be able to bank the unbanked, what about privacy concerns? What about discrimination? And there are a growing number of papers trying to look at what does this mean for discriminations? Could you sort of back channel, information that you may not be able to use otherwise through fair lending acts? And it certainly poses a challenge to regulators as to how should we think and regulate about this space. And so, overall, is the digital footprint useful for payment behavior? Certainly, many companies seem to be using it. The research backs this, that even a shallow digital footprint is extremely informative. It complements as opposed to substitutes for credit bureau scores, and it works equally well for people who don't even have credit bureau scores. This, of course, and this is, we haven't looked at deep digital footprints where you can clearly do a lot more. And so more work is needed, both using different data and environment. And this has many, many implications, which are of great interest to the global community, for banks and their model for access to credit for the unbanked, for regulators, consumers, and firms. What does this mean? How should we behave in this digital space?
Thank you very much, Manju, for covering so many grounds in such a short period of time. For discussion, let's go to someone who types both of his names in lowercase. Sumi Agawa, please. Sumi, you're on mute. Yeah, perfect.
I am just loading up my slides. Okay, can you guys see my slides? Can you see?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So thank you for having me here. I'm going to talk about fintech and the future of finance. Basically, I'll just try to pick up where Manju is leaving off. I think the real impact of fintech and finance is in developing countries as opposed to developed countries, mainly because if I look at in developing countries, consumers can leapfrog using this technology. And this has huge implications for consumer welfare. If you think about in the old days, landline versus cell phones, computers versus smartphones, and nowadays when we think about e-wallets in small villages in India and Africa versus bank branches, more broadly, what Manju was talking about, 2 billion people around the world don't have access to banking. 45 million people in America itself don't have access. And in India, if you think about 850 million people don't have access to credit, And TransUnion says that if we give access to these people for even around 150 million, that will be huge. But what do these people do have is majority of them actually have a cell phone, okay? So Manju talked about the dark side. I'm not gonna go into there. I'm not really gonna discuss Manju's paper, but I'm gonna pick up where Manju left off, which is about shallow versus deep. And secondly, picking off from looking into a developing country where we don't really have credit scores, and discuss a couple of ideas there and see what is really happening in this space. So I'm looking at this exactly the question of what will happen if we have social and mobile footprints using mobile phones, and then try to see if we can predict defaults using this alternative credit scores. You can think about this is exactly what Manju is trying to allude, that let's not use credit scores. Let's try to see if we can find alternative forms of credit scores. So what we do is we try to look at what is happening in India. We collected this massive data from one of the fintech company, which gave out around 360,000 loan applications. What we here do have is this deep footprint, okay, social footprint, which is we have a type of applications they have on their mobile device versus things like Amazon, Flipkart, travel applications, dating applications, social media applications, financial applications. We also know if you log in through LinkedIn versus Facebook, iOS, which Mandu talked about, Android versus other types of phones. And then we also have the call log. So we know who you called, what are the SMSs you were making, what time you were calling. So were you calling your mother versus were you calling your friends? And can we use that to predict if you're a safer customer, especially using your call log information? So we are going to call this as the deep social footprint, basically because of this call log data that we can utilize, the time of the day, who are you calling, how many times you call the person, and is that informative about your type, which is essentially talking about, are you less risky all of a sudden? So using this data, we follow similar approach that Manju has described. What you actually see, there is a huge lift in the AOC of this credit scores of up to 51% using this mobile and social footprints. And if we do out of sample, we actually get also a big lift. So these social footprints have a big predictive power. So this is on one side. I wanted to show what can be done or advanced in exactly what Manju brought up. Let me discuss one more idea, which is, can we use fintech to learn from the fintech and how migrant workers? So, I mean, my objective was to show what is the effect of fintech in developing countries, and especially for poor people. So here we are looking at maids and foreign workers in Korea who now actually have this mobile device through which they can transfer money home. Earlier, they would go to a bank or a credit union, and the credit union will charge them enormous amounts of money. What this application does is allows these people to not only remit and transfer, but also have this feature of cancellation. So I can say, I want to transfer money today, but within 24 hours, this application says you can cancel and transfer again, because exchange rates may fluctuate. So the maids pay a lot of attention to what the exchange rate is today and tomorrow. So here I have two examples. One is a remittance you did on 2019 on 6th of June at, 20th of June at 2 p.m. And then it went through because the exchange rate was favorable to you by next day and you transmitted. There is another example which you canceled. First day you tried to make the payment and then you realize the next day the exchange rate was unfavorable to you. And so you actually withdrew that and canceled that transfer, and then you did a new transfer the next day. Now, what we are trying to look here as, does the social network, this fintech application allows you to create? So essentially, I did that cancellation. Do I then immediately SMS my friends and tell them, if you did your transfer yesterday, cancel it right now, because if you cancel it, you can get better exchange rates today and transfer again. And what we find is a lot of the people, when they have a social network due to this fintech device, they immediately choose this cancellation function, and the cancellation function increases their welfare by around 13% by choosing the cancellation function because of this fintech device. If they're very, very savvy, these consumers in our data, obviously they're very sensitive to exchange rates. As soon as the exchange rate changes by even 1%, they will cancel their transfer. Here are some regression results. I guess that font is too small. I'll just kind of speak to it, that in all the regressions of the social networks you form, and you actually learn the cancellation feature. One, you learn the cancellation feature faster, you use it more in sequence, and you transmit it more to your friends. So you do a bunch of things during this cancellation feature to your advantage. And this is kind of something which Manju did a few years ago when she was kind of doing this paper on bank runs, and she was trying to see how information diffuses within a building. And here we are trying to show with a device, how does the information diffuse to your friends by telling them, use the cancellation feature now and don't transfer your money. Here is some results of how these networks get formed. Because once you start out, somebody starts out, they tell their friends, they tell their friends, and once you start using the cancellation feature within that network, you actually form bigger networks as a result, because you are transmitting that information and people are learning that I can actually do a better, get a better exchange rate because somebody is doing it, they're teaching me, they're telling me when and how to cancel my transaction as well. These are pretty much all the comments I have. I mean, I think I'm just trying to take forward where Manju kind of left off in her presentation. There's a lot that can be done. I mean, payments, investments, network, and lending. The dark side is still a very big open question, role of privacy and discrimination, which Manju just talked about. I think the field is wide open. That's why there is a huge number of people in this call, and I hope other people will pick up and see what else can be done.
Thank you very much, Sumit. Another example of leapfrogging by fintech is China, and no one knows about the leapfrogging experience better than our next speaker, Long Chen, who will share his thought with us about the evolving interactions between the real economy and fintech. Long, please.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you, but we see your slide number 7. Is it by intention, by design, or?
No.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, that's it. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. So I'm so happy to share my thoughts after hearing several other scholars talking about what data information can do to finance. So what I'm talking about here is some joint work by my fellow colleagues at LHA Academy, including some of our fellows. We work together. Okay, so give me a second. So we all know the value of finance. So finance in nature is a service of individual information. So the two keywords, information and individual, corresponds to two key obstacles of finance. They are information costs and the lack of scalability. So if we look at the current financial system and to see how it deals with these problems, if we first look at the financial accounts, then globally, there's even very recent where there's still about 1.7 billion people who do not have bank accounts. Now, if I quote the seminal work by Kotelek back in 1998, The Money is Memory, so I could argue that a lot of people do not have financial accounts because they do not have trustworthy information being measurable and recorded in an account. So cash and collateral still are the hard currencies. Now, if you look at if you look at business lending, then even in the United States, about 60% of the commercial and industrial loans are secured. And a large chunk of the SME loans SMEs are financially constrained because they do not have enough collaterals. And the progress of the microloans is not advancing as far as we have hoped, presumably because the cost of collecting and verifying information is not very scalable in a traditional way. If you look at consumer lending, very similar that even in the United States, about 85% of the consumer loans are secured. And the part of the non-secured the loans, the consumer credit is very much related to the payment, and that requires a high cost of collecting and processing information. And finally, if you look at the wealth management, Piketty's point is well taken that the wealthy people get wealthier because they have money to invest. The average people, they underinvest. One key reason is because of lack of trustworthy information. So as we can see, that information has been a major obstacle in finance because, again, finance is a service based on individual information. Now, the question here is, what can digital technology do in this regard? So I'm going to make 4 claims. I think they are major trends that can describe what's going on. The first, then I'm going to provide some evidence to verify those claims. My first claim is that there is an information revolution. There's a break point around the arrival of the mobile internet. We've been talking about the information revolution for a long, long time, of course. But I think really what's taking off is the arrival of the mobile internet, because right after that, both the consumption and production behaviors becomes much more measurable, tractable across space and time. And that goes with the rise of the digital finance. The second major trend is the capacity transformation. Starting from mobile period, I think the digital revolution is deeply transforming the accessibility and the risk assessment and the risk management of finance. So both the supply and demand of finance become much more real time. So that's the capacity transformation. The third major trend is the integration of finance with the real economy. So the rise of the digital finance goes with the pace of the digitalization of the real economy. But of course, the interesting thing is that they don't exactly take off, like I think Daryl mentioned earlier, because the pace of the digital penetration is actually an art. It depends not only on technology, it also depends on unsatisfied demand and habitual resistance from that country. So it could be very complicated. And finally, I think a major trend is the open finance. The rise of both the digitization of finance and the real economy requires that the many financial institutions and the fintechs, they have to work together because they have different strengths to serve the same customers. So open finance is becoming more and more inevitable, even though there's a lot of competition between them, but it's really, there's a lot of need for them to work with each other. Now, let me give you some of the evidence we're seeing in China. Let me first talk about mobile payment. Now, if you look at the first graph on the left, you can see that in the past 6-7 years, actually, it's Asia's non-cash payment, is the mobile payment really grows the fastest. So it's not every continent grow exactly the same speed, but I think that's led by China, India, and some other Asian countries. Now, if we look at China, then you can see on the right hand, you can see where is the breaking point I'm talking about. Back in around the year 2010, 2011, China's e-commerce as the portion of the retail is only about 1% of the retail sales in China, which is actually below United States and many other countries. At that time, China's mobile payment is very similar to United States. One is 15 billion, another is like 8.3 billion US dollars. But then China in the past 10 years or so, it just really took off. It's right surrounding the mobile internet period. So I agree with some of the previous speakers. This is particularly meaningful for the developing regions. They can pick up the technology and grow faster. This is something called inclusive growth. Now, so that's the mobile payment. And another really interesting story is the battle between the QR code and the traditional point of sales machine. Now, in traditional payment method, you really have to have a point of sales machine that try to collect information from different parties and verify the information. It's costly. And it also requires every merchant to have, in China back in 2011, it requires every merchant to have the deposit above several thousand RMB to have that POS machine. And for every transaction, it charges 1% to 0% of fees. Now, if you use the QR code, of course, then there's zero collateral, and the fee, the payment becomes much lower, and it's real-time settlement. So that's why even beggars now use the QR code, because that's their modern time POS machine. And so, but it's not only just that it's much cheaper for the merchants and for the customers. Actually, it's much safer too. Using the alternative information, just Manju and other speakers just talk about, really, you have the real-time risk management. So if you compare to the traditional, the payment methods, the fraud loss rate was about 0.0%. But really, if using the mobile payment, using the alternative data, real-time data and risk management, then your default rate becomes several scale. It's just, I cannot even pronounce that number. You can look at it, but it's just the several scales much lower. So that's why I've never met a single person in my life that has the fraud loss happen in mobile payment. Now, so that's the what I'm trying to talk about is that the information and digital technology really has changed how payment is being done, become much more inclusive. But not only that, but now you have because in the beginning I talked about financial account. Now you have a mobile account. Now the mobile financial account, that really means that it has a remote identity that is trustworthy. So that can spur a whole list of the innovations, including sharing economy. And including unattended retailing. You can buy things, for example, this is the interesting paper studied by Ouyang, who is a PhD candidate from Princeton. He's been working at the LHA Academy for about 2 years now. And you can see his work. You can see that in this graph, you can see the interesting question here is that if you want to develop the mobile payment, should you start with the supply side or demand side? That's the art of the network. So here that is looking at for horizontal access tells in a city that has a lot of new bicycles, the bicycle sharing. But you can see that if the bicycle amount is very small, then the activity of the users doesn't take off. But really, with some supply side of the bicycle, then it's really the whole thing just take off. And when the customer becomes more active, then actually that effect of the data spill over to the ability for them to get credit. So that's the wonderful part, the kind of the footprint that brings more additional financial availability in this particular case. Now, so that's some examples on the payment part. Let me say something about SME lending. Now, in the SME lending, in the traditional way, we use the hard information, structured hard information, like the credit score Manju just mentioned earlier. But what we're really seeing in practice is that a lot of the efforts have been used to find the hard information in soft information using the alternative data, and also turn a lot of the alternative unstructured information into the structured data information. So in that way, it becomes much more useful. You can call this the deeper alternative score. You know, in this way, then you suddenly make and because that method is actually very scalable. So that becomes a new way of providing the credit service that is the scalable and the sustainable. So you can see that then in the past 10 years or so, with our experience at Ant Financial, they have my bank has served more than 35 million SMEs, and half of them are women entrepreneurs. You can see that actually the percentage of credit divided by the per capita scale by GDP is the less developed regions, they have higher share. So that is really inclusive in this way. And also, just now, a couple of the speakers worry about that if you have kind of AI to screen the customers, that leads to discrimination. And actually, indeed, the Thomas Philippon had a similar concern last year. If we look at the age group, education group, gender group, we do not see that happen. So at least in evidence here, we're not seeing, and this is really large scale evidence, we're not seeing that thing. Now this is other paper by Professor Huang Yi. I believe he's still online today, and what he shows is that those SMEs, if they are able to use, because of the alternative data, they are able to get the lending without collateral, as Ben Holmstrom famously claimed, information is the new collateral. And so here you can see that then that's very beneficial to those firms that are able to get those non-collateral lending because of the data. And so, and finally, what I'm showing here is that this is not just providing to those SMEs, the ones who are lacking the data, but lacking the collateral, but actually it's kind of safe, because you can see this is a delinquency rate, a 90-day delinquency rate. It's clearly below the rural commercial banks, comparable banks, or the city commercial banks. It went up a bit during the COVID period, but it still goes down because of the real-time risk management of the data. So you can see that this is a sustainable thing to do things. Now, let me spend a little bit more time to talk about consumer lending. How much time do I have, Sanjay? 2 minutes?
2 or 3 minutes, is it okay?
Got it. Yeah, should be fine, yeah. Okay, let me talk a bit about the consumer lending. The consumer lending is very similar. You can see as I mentioned, so you can see that the left graph here is the shock to China's consumption during COVID, then it kind of recovered after that earlier last year. Now, if you compare to the right-hand picture, you can see that compare the people using the credit pay and without using the credit pay. But what you can imagine here is that, as I mentioned, in the consumer lending tends to be a lot of those uncollateralized consumer lending is very much related to the payment. But here, because payment becomes much more powerful, because so much more real-time information, you can see that it helps the lending a lot. It really benefits the people who are using it. You can compare the people who use and who do not use credit pay. You can clearly see that the ones using it, they get hurt much less during the COVID period. So that's on the demand side. On the supply side, because it's actually credit pay, it connects the supply and demand. You can see that on the supply side. If you compare the merchants who accept the credit pay, then compare with the one that do not accept, then clearly the ones do not accept get really hurt. Now, if you think this indulgent, the ones who has higher penetration and lower penetration of credit pay, you can see that the ones have the higher lower penetration, the deeper color, they got hurt again more during the COVID period because of the distancing hurting. Now, and this graph shows that if you compare the regimes, in the regimes with higher GDP on the right-hand side, they tends to use the credit card, accept credit card even more. On the left-hand side, with regimes with a lower GDP, they accept the credit pay using the alternative data even more. So it's really complementary to the current financial system to make it more inclusive. Now, finally, I want to say something about open finance. I think that's also very exciting. Now, what I observe on Alipay's the platform, we can see that. So let's look at the numbers. Now, by the end of last year, it has close to 200 institutions on Alipay's the wealth management platform. It has 170 million investors. So it's all those institutions, the customers. There's 51 million users that watch a lot of live stream shows, and they have this 6,000 professional investors, advisors. And there's a lot of hundreds of millions of contents and videos produced. And so it connects the investors and financial advisors with the financial products. And it's for the first time I've witnessed, I've been lived in the US for a long time. I think it's first time I can see that people have very little money, $10, they can have a real-time financial advisor to help them go through up and down. It also has with the hope of, so investors can get help from education content, discussion forums, news analysis, select different products. They also have robot advisors. So that put together is the platform nowadays. Now you can see that these are the contents put out by the financial institutions. They are really spend a lot of time to make their contents really interesting to attract their own investors. And then the next is that I think every Chinese know that live streaming is really popular in China. So all those professional analysts tell the customers they have very little money or a lot of money, tell them exactly what's going on to help them to go through up and downs. And also we have they have their own online forums for the investors to talk about what should they do, what should they buy, etc. And they have the robot advisors these days that they're doing very cool things to help them start from every step of helps them to improve their financial literacy and for decision making. Now my time is up, but my intent to give you a glimpse, I'm trying to answer the question of what information revolution is doing to finance. So I'm making 4 claims. I think, of course, there's information revolution, but my first claim is that I believe that it's really taking off around the arrival of the mobile internet, because at that time, both the consumption and production behavior becomes much more measurable and trackable, and with the rise of the large scale of the digital finance. The second part is that we can see clearly and consistent with previous speakers that we can see a lot of alternative data. Wonderfully, it changes converts soft information to the hard information, unstructured information to structured information. By doing so, we can see that it's deeply transforming accessibility, risk assessment, and management of the finance. So both and supply demand becomes much more real time. And with that, the digitization of the finance is being increasingly integrated with the real economy. Of course, it depends on the country. And this is, I agree with previous Sumit, that this is particularly wonderful for the emerging markets where there's a lot of unsatisfied demand and more attitude to embrace digital technology. And finally, I think because of this integration between the real economy and the finance, really only finance is not enough. You need a lot of technology, a lot of connectivity. So that means that the financial institutions and fintechs, even though there's competition, there's a lot of room for them to work together to have the open finance that is become much more inevitable. That is the future happening right now.
Thank you very much, Long. Let's go to Robert Townsend for his thoughts, please. Long, maybe you can unshare the screen, please. Yeah, perfect.
Can you see this?
We are not seeing anything yet.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah, now we are seeing your slides.
Okay. So thank you very much for asking me to participate. It's really quite a great event and a panel, and particularly to discuss Long Chen's paper. So we had talked, Long Chen and I talked last week, so I wanted to pick up on something related to what he had said and his talk today, which is what's the big deal about payments? So one premise, it's really all about the data. So if you think about digital payments, it's a log of transactions and like a cash flow statement. And indeed, that's exactly how we create ledgers in financial accounts. By having the underlying transactions data, you can run checks, the balance sheet becomes integrated with the income statement and so on. So you can actually get, in principle, the financial accounts out from digital payments. This has various desirable features. First of all, changes in the stocks of assets would be consistent in the flows, whether or not you own it. If you own it, did you use it, and so on. And shockingly, let me tell you that no of the many famous and deservedly well-known US micro surveys, absolutely none of them meet this standard in terms of the consistency of stocks and flows. Another good feature of the payments data is that you're reconciling transactions across parties and doing it instantaneously. Now, to harken back to something Daryl said, this actually gets harder when you have multiple payment providers because you will have multiple databases. And so one can think the big picture, which is how do you create better information infrastructure in the US and other places. And I would propose that there are many insights available from data science if we're thinking about better designs that deal with synchronous versus asynchronous, was something we've got used to from Zoom and lecturing, but it has a different meaning here. Centralized versus decentralized systems and the difficulty of scaling, as in completely centralized. Computer scientists refer to these as CRUD systems, where only delegated people have the authority to create, read, update, and delete with potential problems therein, or the decentralized systems where there are theorems about the impossibility of having both consistent, available, and partition tolerant systems all at the same time. So this slide is at the heart of Longchen's comments. Payments, it doesn't stop with payments. From payments, you get to financial access. And this is not a new idea. The G20 adopted this as a formal part of the agenda years ago. And of course, from financial access built on payment systems, you get to impacts on the real economy. And vice versa, they all become intermingled together. So an example of this in Africa, well known as M-Pesa, running on a private system, Safaricom. But let me point out that it's actually tricky in many contexts to make the conversion from pure paper currency to these e-money systems. An example would be CBDC and the Central Bank of Bahamas. They have it, they're doing it. But if you listen carefully to the comments of the governor, they've actually had problems in more rural and remote islands getting people off of the currency. There are, of course, success stories, and Alipay is one of them. And you've heard already this morning in Longchen's talk, credit reaching tiny businesses operating in small markets instantaneously, including beginning of day borrowing and end of day payment. It's quite remarkable. Alipay also has run insurance portals with millions of users and has mutual aid through its system, as with COVID injections, the wealth management platform you heard about, and the commerce that takes place, e-commerce and so on. But that actually links back to the real economy, because beneath all the e-commerce lies the real shipping logistics and so on, where Alipay has also made considerable investment. Another success story to balance this thing a bit is Pix in Brazil. They're making great strides. They require their commercial banks. And Daryl again was saying, how do we get banks to do this? In the US is one thing. In Brazil, they just mandated it. And I don't know the back channel story of how they overcame the political economy forces, but all banks are required to offer electronic banking. And it's not just payments, as in Pix, they're building up credit registries. I think something akin to Alipay. Okay, but still caveat at the end, it seems to me there's a dangerous allure in these new technologies. the question is always, what are we trying to build? As in the applications, insurance is potentially different from credit, is different from wealth management, but there's a tendency to think that one can separate engineering as in coding up new CBDC for the US or other places as separate from the economics of what we're trying to accomplish. So we must bring the economics and the technology into it jointly and focus on the applications rather than thinking we're going to design some universal a priori all-purpose system. Another way to emphasize what I think is a danger here are the buzzwords, which we hear in the US and other countries. Fast payments, great, what's wrong with that? Real-time gross settlement, atomic swaps of assets, as if these were the desirable features, and they can be, but they do come with problems that we are aware of already, namely liquidity problems, managing, no one holds enough liquidity to be able to honor all the payments that are at the beginning of the day in a given central bank. It doesn't happen. Systems economize on liquidity. Another issue that was raised earlier is the information revelation problem that can come with atomic swaps. So there are actually trade-offs with new versus legacy systems that need to be thought through carefully. So my last slide, I deliberately have only 3. I want to touch on what I think is a very misleading debate about information, because you will hear it said that we have to preserve privacy. That's paramount. In Europe, but also US, other places, you'll also hear that a la Hirschleifer, once information acquired, it should become a public good. So data as public poses a dichotomy as if we had to choose one or the other of these systems. And it's not the case. Encryption allows data to be kept private, but nevertheless allows analysis of the data in these encrypted homomorphic spaces. So the computer scientists have excelled in multi-party computation and fully homomorphic encryption. And you can run the smart contracts as part of applications on these encrypted spaces. So now again, we need to make choices depending on the applications. Others that haven't come up so much yet, you can have auctions to allocate financial products and so on. You can run those auctions without auctioneers. You do not need trusted third parties with everything encrypted, actually. You can get insurance and embed that within these credit liquidity systems, and you don't need the planner of mechanism design. You use the guidelines for mechanism design and implement through encryption without the planner. You can get aggregation of data on the ledgers through encryption. So even though all the accounts are private, you nevertheless have some aggregate numbers can be used by private sector and government and so on, and you can securitize small and medium enterprise debt with these new technologies. So let me just conclude with a word about the nature of competition, especially on this slide having to do with information. When we talk about open competition, we should make a distinction. My experience is that what works well is ex-ante competition among private, maybe in competition with public, for the rights to provide services, but not ex-post competition, not siphoning off customers who are under a given contract, because that can undercut desirable incentives. Similarly, you can have platforms mediating trade and so on, but the information collected on the platform should not be under the auspices of the party running the platform. For example, if they sell statistics for gain, that can actually create an adverse incentive effect. This is the paper with Antoine Martin and Michael Lee. Likewise, you can program information and actually deliberately keep some of it private, which relates to Akerlof's lemon problem. You know, if there's too much information out there, then basically the market can shrink to zero. But here you don't let a private party do it. You pre-program it in code, so that it's the decision about how much information is being released to investors. And finally, let me just say, this is not meant to be a contest between the public and private sector, as proposed the comments about Diem and so on. Distributed ledgers actually are helpful to regulators in allowing solutions to problems like coordination and runs on markets and so on. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much for these points. I hope some of those points can be picked up later during our open discussion as well. So beyond the interaction between fintech and real economy, we also want to think about interaction between fintech and more traditional financial institutions. And for that, let's turn to Xavier Vives. Xavier, please.
Thank you. Let me share. Let's see. So do you see the screen?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to be in this very interesting session. I will talk mostly about the new entrants and incumbents and competitive strategies or cooperative strategies between them. And I base my comments on some relatively recent work, which I have published in the Annual Review of Financial Economics and also in a report of the Banking Initiative here at ESA. So let me just start very briefly, although quite a few things have been said by the people that have preceded me, that the impact of fintech and big tech is important and rising, but really is differential, so it's not uniform across regions and jurisdictions and sectors. So it's quite important in payments. For example, is impacting not only national payments, but cross-border payments is quite important and growingly important in credits, for example, mortgages in the US, for example. It has extended the market, allowing much more financial inclusion of people, in particular in emerging and developing countries that had no access to financial services. We have seen this already today. And also another point that I think has already been made, all these, in particular in emerging and developing economies, has been allowed or has been possible because of technological leapfrogging. So people that have never had a bank account, then bank with a mobile phone. Lending, in particular, by big tech and fintech in general, is rising rapidly, but there are differences among regions. So typically, big tech is gaining and has gained more traction in emerging and developing economies, while fintech has gained more and other fintechs, which are not if you want the services not provided by big tech platforms, they have made more inroads in more advanced economies. So here we see it, for example, not in big tech being more predominant in Argentina, Brazil, China, than in the United Kingdom or the US, where other fintech are much more important. And Korea, South Korea, it's a particular, in this case, is a particular case. Let me highlight, because let me compress the points in a few minutes. As I perceive, what are the advantages and disadvantages of fintechs? The advantage are a superior technology, which is free of legacy systems. For example, you have to use the mainframe, the heavy and not flexible mainframes, and you can use directly the cloud computing and linear operation systems. It has a friendly consumer interface, which is new standard for consumer experience, in particular based on the mobile phone. It focuses also, it may focus, and it has focused, the entrants have focused on activities and business segments with higher returns. For example, payments and cross payments, where the intermediation margins were quite fat, and there was quite a bit of inefficiency, as we have seen also in other talks today. Also, they typically have been operating with more equity funding than banks, although this is variable and it may depend on sectors. And quite importantly, have been able to attract the best talent. So the most talented students do not want to work for the financial system, but they do want to work for big techs and fintechs. What are the disadvantages? Well, the absence of an installed and loyal customer base, because there are entrants. Some obviously are getting there, but not when they start. Limited access to staff information, although this they may compensate with advanced technology like machine learning to transform some of this digital footprint into hard information. A lack of reputation and brand recognition because they are entrants, and also a high cost of capital, okay, and a small balance sheet. Although in some cases, like in the US, for example, a small balance sheet has not been an obstacle for mortgage lenders, fintech mortgage lenders, for example, to operate, because they sell, basically, they package and sell the loans to the government-sponsored enterprises. Also, and finally, they have a lack of regulatory and risk management expertise and experience. And this is quite important because this is a very regulated sector, and obviously you do not want to upset the regulator. And no access to the central bank backstop without a banking license. Okay, all these are advantages and disadvantages of fintechs, which we may say entrants or small fintechs. When we get to big tech platforms, then in principle they have all the advantages, but with almost none of the drawbacks, except the regulatory and central bank access to the access to the central bank stock, plus what? Lots of data, exploitation of network economies, advanced technology to process information, like with machine learning. We've seen like they may this technology analyzing digital footprints may do better than credit bureaus, than the traditional technology, for example, for credit ratings. They have a deep pocket and also lobbying power. So this means that big techs, in principle, have a potential more severe disruption capacity for the traditional banking business. Now, to what extent the emergence of fintech in general will make banking more contestable? Well, I think it is, but we'll have to provide some caveats, because there are some countervailing effects. Definitely, this more efficient technology, competitive pressure, but also we have to think that even in the digital world, there are quite a bit of endogenous and exogenous switching costs and monopolization possibilities that we will discuss. And also the enhanced price transparency brought by digital technology may have ambiguous dynamic pricing effects, although this I will not have time to talk about today. Let's go back to the strategies of the incumbents and the fintechs. So let's think rather now about the small entrant fintechs. What are the potential strategies of those fintechs? Well, a first idea is that they may commit to remain small, and what's in the IO terminology would be to remain like a puppy dog, which is not threatening, maybe do not get a banking license, and form partnerships and collaborate with the incumbents, serve on bank segments of the population, and therefore do not compete directly, obviously, with the banks, okay, because you're serving unserved segments. Or no, you be more aggressive, basically compete more head-to-head, entry maybe as a licensed digital bank, This has been less likely given the high compliance cost involved, but we see that some are taking this route. We'll see what happens in the end, whether they consolidate, help incumbents, or grow to be a full-fledged financial intermediary. What about the incumbents? Well, the incumbents may discriminate by segment, and again, may have two types of strategy: accommodate or fight, right? If they accommodate, then in the animal terminology, it would be like a peaceful fat cat. Okay, that well, they say, okay, I'll let you in, there are high switching costs, and I may even charge you some interchange fees to get to my base, and so on, we coexist. Or fight, like even trying to prevent entry or limit the entry with a top dog strategy, maybe shut down or degrade access to the infrastructure, make life difficult for the entrance. And obviously, and some banks have done that, launch their own fully online banks. You know, some of the more savvy incumbents are launching full online banks to test the waters and also compete with the fintechs. Okay. Now, what about the big techs? The big techs, again, they have in general the same type of taxonomy in terms of the strategies. They can accommodate or fight, let's say. Accommodating means to form partnerships, and there are quite a bit which are exploring. So Citi has a partnership with Google because Citi is only present in some major cities, and to get more deposits, partners with Google, and Google gets information in exchange. Okay, so that's one example. Or credit cards, or credit with Amazon and Bank of America, Apple, Goldman Sachs, etc. Okay, so there are some partnerships which are part probably long-term collaboration and part of it testing the waters. Or they can try to compete more head-to-head. One strategy, which is not the one we see for now, is to become banks intermediaries, full-fledged banks with a banking license, exploiting all the bundling their offerings, exploiting all the economies of scope they may. But obviously, if they become banks and accept deposits, then they are subject to regulation, or they may fall short of that, okay, because then the regulatory jump may be important. Or they may just take the strategy of be a multi-sided platform, a marketplace, where in this platform, basically they do whatever the others do, but better. And they try to monopolize the interface with customers with their ecosystem, and then basically have all the financial providers having to go through the platform. Okay. And I will, in fact, let me just explain this graphically, and I'll come back to the incumbents. So this would be something like this, no? A future where would be financial services providers, which basically go through a platform to sell the products. So basically, all products would be sold eventually, or mostly all products in a platform, which could be in the ecosystem or a big tech, or with an incumbent, which has been kind of platform transformed, let's say. Okay. The incumbents, and let me just take a step back for a moment, may again accommodate or fight. Accommodate with the partnerships, as we have seen the examples I have put, or maybe providing some specialized, unique banking services and products, or fight, no, compete head-to-head, also by becoming a platform or a marketplace, like I said here. Okay. Now here there are some pros and cons or even advantages or disadvantages that the incumbents have. They may profit from some superior trust from customers and data security. Many people probably would rather trust their bank with financial data than Facebook, let's say, okay, just to say, to put an example. Also, they have better regulatory navigation skills and similar lobbying power than big tech. But what they cannot do is match the big tech's bundling, cross-subsidization strategy. So that, in a sense, the ecosystem of the big techs is much larger and deeper, and which can draw financial connections in many dimensions, which for the incumbents is much more difficult. Okay, so the question is, whether we're moving towards a kind of a new platform-based oligopoly with some big techs and platform transformed incumbents, okay, to distribute financial products to different ecosystems, okay. And then the question is what degree of competition this will entail, no? What's clear is that at the beginning, the impact of digital disruption will be very strong, okay, and this will erode incumbent budget. This is happening and fast, for example, in payments, in cross payments, and even in some credit products, mortgages, etc., and increased competitive pressure and contestability. Obviously, this means, and as it is happening, incumbents have to restructure. They have overcapacity in branches. They have to invest more heavily in information technology. There is a lot of consolidation in Europe. In Spain, we have quite a bit, for example, now. But what about the long run impact? So this will depend on the extent of entry of basically big tech, which will depend quite a bit on regulation. If I have time, I will make a note of that. But then the degree of competition between the platforms or ecosystems, which all try to kind of monopolize the interface with customers, but obviously this might be quite competitive because you are all trying to do the same. And then the degree of competition between these big tech or platforms, if you want, will depend quite a bit of the switching costs, which will be there, and interoperability. So I think the basic idea here is that the more, the easier is to move from one platform to another, the more competition there will be, okay? So the more difficult is to move from one platform to another, the less competition. And this will be the key of, I think, of the degree of competition in the market. And I am not sure that antitrust authorities have understood this yet, okay? I'm not completely sure. So, because now they are taking just a track which is like saying that some big techs may be too dominant, but maybe they are not paying enough attention to the possibilities of the competition among big techs and entering into their jobs. But this is obviously an open issue. So, to end, should regulation aim at a level playing field or favor entrants in order to promote competition? And what are the implications for financial stability? So just very briefly, because there is not much time. Well, regulation will be key, okay? And it's clear that the competitiveness of entrants will depend on the extent of regulatory burden and on the extent of the guarantees that they have or that they do not have, okay? And still it's not clear where will be. Will there be and is there a level playing field? Well, there is not now, and we'll see how it will evolve. So for example, in open banking, now there is an asymmetry information sharing requirements in Europe, for example, between the directive and the privacy laws, GDPR. So in the sense that, for example, now banks have to open their data if the customer wants to other competitors, but not the other way. Okay, and this is something also the European Union is thinking about. As I said, all the issues of data ownership, portability, and interoperability will be key for the degree of competition. And what is being considered, obviously, is whether there has to be different compliance burdens for dominant players or entrants. And now there is, the US Congress is looking at it, the UK has looking at it, and also the European Union. And this is, I think, is developed. An important issue is that a principle that is, I think, regulators try to establish, which is to regulate activities in the sense that the same regulatory rules should apply, is a principle that tries to be applied, is problematic. It's problematic because what fails, if you think about financial stability, and now we have a bridge with financial stability here, is that entities are those that fail. And therefore, regulators are rethinking also that it's not so simple to apply the principle, same activity, same regulation, okay? Because it's not the same activity in a small fintech than in a large fintech or a large income, for example, because of the systemic effects that it may have in different entities. Another point which is important and has to be taken into account, is that heightened regulatory pressure fosters shadow banking. Okay, so if you put a lot of pressure on the regulated entities, on the banks, for example, like in mortgage providers in the US, well, then they become, most of the mortgages are provided by shadow banks, in which a good fraction are fintechs. This is a usual problem that we know on regulation, but that again has to be resolved. And obviously, what's clear is that consumer protection now is paramount because of the issues that have been, other people have already explained, price discrimination, potential problems with data privacy, potential exploitation through the digital footprint of behavioral biases of consumers, etc.
Xavier, would it be
Yes.
possible for you to conclude in 30 seconds to a minute? Roughly?
Okay, so
Thank
last slide. Okay, so just in 30 seconds, financial stability implications. We know that increased competitive pressure decreases profits typically, and in particular of the incumbents, and this may increase their incentives to take risks. So this has to be taken into account by the regulators. But at the same time, this new technology, we have evidence that makes banks more stable. Okay, so that individually, okay, so that banks that are more advanced in IT adoption, they have less non-performing loans. And also, at the end of the day, we have to take into account the new sources of systemic risk, like the contamination of bank and non-bank activities in platforms, failure of third-party providers, and cyber attacks, which are becoming more and more important. In fact, cyber attacks, I think it's something that we'll be talking for a long time. Parallel systems are not yet adequately monitored by the central banks, development of large online money market funds, which are not insured. So all these are new issues that we have to take into account. And I leave it here in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For additional thought on the subject, let's go to John Frost, please.
Thank you very much.
Xavier, we might
I
need you to
be
unshare your screen. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'm going to pull up my slides. Here we are. So I'll just check that they're visible.
Indeed.
Great. So it's a great pleasure to take part today and to discuss this contribution by Xavier. This gets to the heart of the industrial organization issues around fintechs versus big techs versus incumbents in the financial sector, and also the public policy trade-offs. So you know, there's the triangle that Xavier had in the slides that discusses the trade-offs between different policy goals, and I think this is really key. There's a lot to discuss here, but I'll be very brief, and let me note at the outset that the usual disclaimer applies. So we've talked about financial inclusion, and just to give some evidence to this, you know, there has been a really very real impact of fintech and big tech players on financial inclusion, at least access to transaction accounts in countries around the world. I'll just highlight that in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, it's been mobile money that's really driven this big increase in access to transaction accounts. And mobile money is often provided by telecom providers, you know, who we consider big techs. Also in East Asia and Pacific and in South Asia, you see this really dramatic increase. And of course, the big tech players, Alipay, Google Pay in India, you know, these have played a very important role. And we talked a bit about the differences between, you know, advanced economies and emerging market economies, the potential for leapfrogging. I just wanted to provide some new evidence here that could help to put this in context. There is really a bifurcation at the global level. We've seen, if you look at the downloads of the largest finance apps, this is from ongoing research, there's a bifurcation. So fintechs have seen wider adoption in advanced economies. This is in blue on the left. Fintech apps have been downloaded to a great extent. And big tech apps, seen here on the right, have made much larger inroads in emerging market economies. You'll see that there are some spikes, annual spikes in this, and I'm certain that the you know, annual periodicity in China is a very large explanation for this. Notably, if you look at concentration in the downloads of finance apps, you can see that it's actually declined over time, both in AEs and EMEs. It's ticked up just a bit recently in AEs, as measured by the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So we see that there is this important difference in fintechs versus big techs, in advanced versus emerging market economies. But so far, we've not seen a dominance of the market, at least at an aggregate level. Now, there's this key insight from Xavier's work, which is key to the industrial organization outcome that we should expect. They note that in the short run, digitalization will increase the contestability of banking services. Mechanically, if there are new entrants, then of course there's greater competition and less concentration. But the long run impact is open, and it depends on the market structure that prevails. So one of the scenarios that he discussed was that big tech firms, together with some platform transformed incumbents, may monopolize the interface with customers, and this is bold for emphasis. Now, they make a convincing case that big techs have many of the advantages that fintechs have without many of the drawbacks. But one drawback that big techs, at least in some jurisdictions, may face is trust by consumers to safeguard their data. We have new evidence. This will be coming out as a BIS bulletin this Thursday. We've looked at trust in different counterparties in the United States based on the survey of consumer expectations run by the Fed. And then we compare this also with views toward willingness to share data with certain counterparts in countries around the world. Now, in the United States, we see that consumers trust traditional financial institutions the most to safeguard their data. They have the most trust in FIs, more so even than in fintechs or in government agencies. They have the least trust in big techs to safeguard their data, according to the survey evidence. And if you look at the international picture, this is from joint work with EY. You see a very similar pattern. So here, the comparisons between traditional financial institutions, fintechs, and non-financial services companies, which includes big techs in most cases. Again, you see that in nearly every jurisdiction, people trust traditional financial institutions with their data the most. Of course, they're used to entrusting their transactions data with banks, and much less used to using fintechs or new non-financial services players. There's one exception to this trend, which I think our hosts may appreciate particularly, which is in China. You can see that the trust in fintechs is actually higher than in traditional financial institutions. And in the case of China, there were some examples given in the EY survey in each case. The examples do include Alipay and WeChat Pay, who are of course big techs, but in this case they were counted as fintechs. This shows you that there's also some murkiness around the terminology used in some cases of fintech versus big tech. But in this case, there actually is higher trust in the likes of Alipay and WeChat Pay than in traditional FIs in China. The US and other countries see a different pattern. Now, there are a number of responses, and of course, this gets into a lot of issues around financial regulation that Xavier talked about, around data privacy and data protection rules, and around competition and antitrust policy. But I'll just mention that there are public policies being tried out to try to mitigate some of the trade-offs. And one, of course, is around public infrastructures. So I think a well-known example that many people have looked at is UPI in India, of course, a retail fast payment system. And what's really striking about UPI is that it is dominated by big techs. So Google Pay, PhonePe, Paytm, which has investment, of course, by Ant, are the largest players in India in mobile payments. But what you've seen is that this is a very fast-growing market. But looking at the market shares within that, the concentration has actually been declining over the past year. So as this market is developing, it's allowed, I think, for fair competition between the different providers. Google Pay, PhonePe, and Paytm all offer services to retail clients. They have to compete on a level playing field. And this has been quite a fluid market where each provider has to really compete to maintain retail services. And so to some extent, this is, a response to the kind of walled gardens. This is an open system that really allows for retail services to be provided in a competitive manner, taking advantage of the network effects of big techs, their ability to embed payment services into their apps, which are of course positive things that users value, but breaking up some of the potential for monopoly that otherwise would emerge. And I think that it's very much in this light that, of course, the Chinese authorities are also considering the ECNY. The ECNY, I think, has been, marketed very much as a response to the current payment market, which is dominated by the duopoly of Alipay and WeChat Pay. And the authorities here are, very much trying to build a platform and infrastructure on which, all of the providers, including the big tech providers, compete on an even footing, can provide retail services, but then exchanging claims on the central bank rather than the current approach, which involves funds that are, held in escrow and then deposited at the central bank as reserves. So I'll stop there, but just to note that there, again, there are very real benefits of big tech for financial inclusion. We have seen, some really dramatic changes. There is this question, I think, as to whether, this monopolization of the client interface will take place, as Xavier mentioned. But at least in emerging market economies, a number of authorities are considering approaches that build a public infrastructure that aims to mitigate some of these tendencies toward monopoly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. When it comes to the effect of fintech on competition and market structure, the last set of remarks are naturally talk about the role of regulation. And some of the previous speakers have also mentioned about the potential of market failure. Of course, when we talk about regulation, there's a risk of both over-regulation as well as under-regulation. For more thoughts on optimal regulation, let's go to a legal scholar and an economist for this. So let's go to Douglas Arner first, please.
Thanks, Shenzhen, and thanks to Lohan for the invitation to be here today. I think we've already picked up on a number of these issues, but I want to try to give a little bit of a structured perspective here. And I think this idea, when we think about big picture trends in financial regulation, if we look back over the past 10 years, really in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, we can say that the crisis was really one of the defining points for financial regulation over the past decade. And that's something that I think we've seen just an absolute transformation in terms of volumes of regulation, cost of compliance, industry structure, and the like. But it's not just regulation in response to the crisis. And I think that importantly, we saw a number of other aspects, in particular, the LIBOR scandal, which changed the way that we approached a lot of regulatory and market issues. And second, a pretty dramatic increase in approaches to market integrity around AML and terrorist financing. The third, of course, has been around technology. And I think, if you're thinking about technology over the past 10 years, of course, the evolution of finance and technology have always been co-developmental, but this combination of, and we sort of highlight 3 points in 2007 to 2009. You have the launch of M-Pesa in 2007, you have the launch of the iPhone in 2007, you have the global financial crisis in 2008, and the Bitcoin white paper in 2008. And that really signals a decade of new technological approaches to finance. And I think that's something that when we think about regulatory issues, pre-2008, we had a very positive approach to innovation in finance. 2008, from a regulatory standpoint, fundamentally changed that approach from the standpoint of conservatism to innovation. And much of the last decade from the standpoint of new technologies really was about a very conservative approach from many regulators to those technologies. I think I'm looking at the beginning of last year, just before COVID, and in some work looking at what I thought were going to be the big themes for regulation over the coming decade of the 2020s, focused in on sustainability issues, on technology, and an ongoing tension between globalization and fragmentation. And I think what we've seen is that in each of these cases, COVID has been accelerating that. I think we've seen a pretty dramatic intensification in the way that we are looking at sustainability from a regulatory standpoint. I'll come back to that. Second, technology. And in this chart, we highlight something that we call FinTech 4.0, which is really all about platforms. And the idea here is, I think, something that Xavier has highlighted. It's something that Christian highlighted as well with 2019, the announcement of the plan to create Libra in its original format, highlighted that the technology that we're looking at over the next decade is much less about margins, new technologies disrupting traditional finance, as opposed to fundamentally doing things in a different way. And I think we can look at this from the standpoint of a couple of different challenges from the standpoint of regulation. One is, prior to 2008, we were looking at a pretty homogeneous population from a standpoint of regulation. Everyone in the industry, we all had pretty much the same viewpoint. And over the past 10 years, with the entry of an increasingly diverse range of new entrants, that has changed this approach. And so we no longer necessarily have a sort of common language, a common sort of knowledge. And that is a challenge for regulators. The second, however, is really around speed of development. And I think it's something that we're all familiar with, particularly with platformization, and that is the potential of things to move very, very quickly. And it's something that from a regulatory standpoint, not just trying to differentiate between what we characterize as too small to care, too large to ignore, and too big to fail, but actually thinking about proportional risk-based approaches that differentiate from the standpoint of these different sorts of contexts. Now, I think if we're thinking about COVID, it's pretty dramatically accelerated these trends. And probably the good news is, from the standpoint of finance, so far, all of that effort that we put in over the past decade from the standpoint of regulation and infrastructure has worked out reasonably well. So far, 2020, 2021, we have not seen financial crises of the sort that we saw in 2008. That's a very positive starting point. However, of course, as we see increasing issues with asset prices and leverage in those markets, concerns are beginning to emerge, and it's something to continue watching going forward. If we look at, I think, 2020, the big driver that we've all been picking up has been around digitization. And it's something that, in the context of finance, we've probably seen more digitization than in most other areas. And I think that if we're thinking about some of the big areas where we're seeing changes, we're actually in some of these seeing things that many of us would have expected to happen over 3, 5, 10 years happening in a year. And the pace of transformation is quite dramatic. The first, and it's something that we've already talked about, particularly between Christian and Dale at the very beginning, transformation of electronic payments. Dramatic increases in electronic payments, but also the reality as highlighted by the initial Libra proposal to use technology to fundamentally redesign payment systems. And of course, where we're seeing this highlighted most extensively is in the context of central bank digital currencies. You know, if we're thinking about payments evolution, this is something that it has taken a long time to get to this point. Really long-term developments, not only in decentralized structures, but also in centralized structures, allowing us to think about designing systems and infrastructure in fundamentally different ways than we've done before. The second is around the use of technology for regulatory and supervisory purposes. And this is something that's not new. If one thinks of something like EDGAR, the SEC's EDGAR system, that is RegTech. That is a form of digital regulatory reporting, which is then the basis of a variety of analytics, not only from the standpoint of monitoring of markets by the supervisors, but of course also by investors, academics, and others. And so this idea of using technology for regulatory and supervisory purposes is not something new, but it's something that over the past 10 years, with the thousands of new post-2008 regulations, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase. And it's something that by the end of 2019, global financial services industry had spent something like a bit over $300 billion on fines for enforcement actions, was spending about $300 billion a year on compliance costs, and was spending about $300 billion a year on IT systems. And so one could already see from the standpoint of financial services, a great deal of focus. But I think the key thing, and if we think about something simple like on-site supervision, on-site supervision in much of the world over much of the past year has not been possible. And as a result of working from home, non-face-to-face interaction, not only between financial institutions and their customers, financial institutions in and of themselves, traders, compliance, risk management, financial institutions and their regulators, and of course, regulators amongst themselves, everyone working from home, this has pretty dramatically changed attitudes in the regulatory and supervisory community to the use of technology for supervisory purposes. And in particular, we're seeing major drives around the world to increase digital regulatory reporting so that information that is being collected is easily digitized and more subjectable to analytics from the standpoint of regulatory and supervisory activities. Third is really around the beginnings of rethinking how we approach market integrity. And if we think about market integrity, AML systems, it's fundamentally based around an analog system that largely evolved in the context of 1970s technological horizons. What does that essentially mean? It means that you have banks who are investigating their customers and they are making reports to regulators when they subjectively think that they find a transaction which is suspicious. It's a very expensive system. It's also one that is not very effective from the standpoint of achieving the market integrity objective. The market integrity objective, of course, is about reducing the criminal and terrorist use of the financial system in order to maintain confidence, as well as protect wider societal order objectives. If we look at the current system, it's pretty useless from an ex-ante preventative standpoint. It's pretty good from the standpoint of once something happens, providing a paper trail to investigate. But it also comes with a range of negative impacts, particularly discussions around de-risking and the disinclination of financial institutions to do business with small businesses, developing countries, and the like. And so we're beginning to see a rethinking about this, that essentially if one thinks about a more data-driven approach, the data is actually being collected in many cases by supervisors, and they have a much more comprehensive set of data than is available to even the largest financial institution in a given economy. And combining this with a series of systems around digital ID, as well as electronic payments monitoring, we are seeing increasing discussions about how can we build better systems. And the last, I think, is one that we've been discussing throughout today, and that is issues around big tech and data. It's something that I think we're seeing some very positive impact, particularly from the standpoint of SME financing. But it's also bringing increasing concerns about concentration both from the standpoint of potential systemic risks, but also concentration from the standpoint of potentially reducing competition and therefore wider innovation. I think if we are thinking of all of these pieces, we can draw out three bigger themes. The first is what my colleagues and I categorize as tech risk. And essentially, this is risks of technology, and it's cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, increasingly, you can see it as one of the biggest financial risks, one of the biggest financial stability risks, and one of the biggest national security concerns. This is something that, from the standpoint of regulation, is a huge focus. Second, around data. And I think when we're looking at data, we're looking at security, we're looking at protection, we're looking at privacy, but we're also looking at differential approaches between major jurisdictions across the US, EU, and China in the context of both societal views of use of data, but also from the standpoint of thinking about how can we get the benefits of aggregation of data for training of AI, big data analytics that can have a longer term beneficial impact from the standpoint of wider competitiveness and development. A big driver that we've seen with the RegTech, SupTech movement, cloud. Now, if you think about any fintech founded in the past 5 years, they're cloud native. But all of our globally systemically important financial institutions are still running on 1970s core IT systems. But the past year, because of the necessity of work from home systems, non-face-to-face customer interactions, has driven that dramatically forward with a lot of very important benefits, but it also highlights a range of potential new risks. And I think where I want to close is one last idea, and that a lot of the discussions around COVID are increasingly turning to how can we build better systems. Digital finance has been a very important lifeline in many jurisdictions. It's provided an important element of response and resilience that is probably going to be important in future sustainability and other crises. But how can we think about, from the standpoint of a digital financial system, building better frameworks? And it really looks at widening digitization, building infrastructure, balanced activities-based, proportional risk-based approaches, and support for the ecosystem, particularly around innovation hubs. Closing bit is really on this infrastructure piece. And I think there's an increasing consensus around the transformative power of sovereign digital identification frameworks, particularly combined with simplified account opening to increase access to accounts. And this is something that for the countries which have it has been incredibly powerful in the context of lockdowns. But that really has to be combined with open access interoperable payment systems. It's this combination that allows digitization of government payments and services, which allows for really an infinite range of experiments in terms of delivering these, but it also reduces the cost of customer acquisition, which enables entry of new participants, as well as new business models. So I think the key piece that I want to leave with is, I think if we're looking at regulatory trends over the next 10 years, a big focus is going to be on sustainability, particularly around infrastructure. A lot of discussions around technology, and particularly the fact that technology is transformative in a way that it was not 10 years ago. And much of our discussions will be about whether or not we should do something because the technology is there to do it. And the last will be around tensions, I think, between localization versus globalization from the standpoint of regulatory approaches. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Vikram, please. Vikram Haskar, I think you have some slides to share as well, right? Perfect. We can see your slides. We cannot hear you though.
There has to be at least one speaker on every conference call who forgets to unmute themselves. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to be able to talk to all of you. So I'm going to be reacting to Doug's presentation. But just to get the standard disclaimer out of the way, these are my views and not necessarily those of the IMF nor its management. So with that said, let me plunge on in. So I think Doug's presentation is really interesting. It covers a very, very wide canvas. I just pulled out a few things that struck me in particular from the discussion on this slide. But there are going to be some of the tensions for regulation are going to be, how do we deal with the range of new actors, calls for proportional regulation. There are going to be needs for experimentation. Sandboxes are certainly one approach. There are going to be questions about, how do we deal with new entrants who are not really financial intermediaries but want to become or behave like one? Will we have new licensing regimes? Doug touched also upon some of the big themes, I think, going forward about the need for new infrastructures, public-private partnerships, digital ID. A lot is being talked about today about CBDCs as well and new forms of money. And I want to zero in the short time that I've got on the data policy question. I find it's very big in Doug's presentation, but frankly, listening to the entire conversation today, I think it's really, I think one of the big transformations in the modern digital economy, but also particularly in finance, is the acquisition and processing of data and its role in these economies. And I think the policy questions, the regulatory questions about how we're going to handle this, I think are coming very much to the center right now. So this is just a picture to show you the many features of the data economy. Data is, of course, a big resource. Questions about value. Whose value is it? Is it the individuals or the data processors? There are questions about competition. There are questions about regulatory cooperation between different objectives of regulators. PSD2, GDPR being talked about. I think there are important cross-border issues as well. Privacy is a very big imperative for many regulators, but there are very differing approaches to privacy across different jurisdictions as well. And you can see issues with the Privacy Shield here as well. And I think there's a broader question about privacy, which is where do we draw the line between the individual's needs for privacy and the social good that can be obtained by wider sharing of data, for example, in biomedical research. And then protecting of data, where the cybersecurity topic is quite central. So let me just say a few words about our thinking about policy frameworks. And we have written a paper about this in 2019. And just to do a bit of self-promotion, we are having a new IMF paper coming out that thinks about what are some of the steps we need for a global approach to principles on data regulation. And so the message of this slide basically is we try to sort of divide the different policy objectives into growth, productivity, you could think of it that way, equity, privacy type considerations, and of course the considerations from a financial stability perspective. And I think I will speak a little bit about each of these, but the key message here is that there are multiple objectives when it comes to the management of data in the modern digital economy. And different pieces of these objectives are handled by different regulators who all have different mandates, actually. And I think we've always talked about policy coordination amongst regulators. I would argue that the policy coordination challenge in the digital economy when it comes to data is even larger because there are more interests, more objectives, and more regulators involved, and some mechanism for having discussion and coordination is, I think, quite crucial. And this is certainly the PSD2 GDPR example is one particular example that comes to mind, but there are others as well. And the basic questions for data policy frameworks are going to be questions around, well, we do want to promote competition. So the topics that Xavier talked about data portability, interoperability, these kinds of questions come up. We do also want, there's a public interest in having data shared widely, certainly with some degree of anonymization, as Rob Townsend spoke about as well. These are things that I think there is a public interest in. There's a question about, is there a role for public infrastructures in terms of providing data utilities, for example? You could think about credit bureaus as a model that's being used in finance. Is there some role for a larger data bureau which handles individual data suitably anonymized and protected? And then, you know, we can't regulate the data sector to such an extent that the incentives for collection and processing and storage of that data get significantly reduced. On the equity side, 2 points here. One is that there's a lot of discussion about privacy. Privacy, of course, is a very important objective, and there are, as I think Doug raised, very different approaches based upon national prerogatives and interests to the issue of privacy in different models across different jurisdictions. The point that one would like to emphasize is that there are mechanisms for enforcing privacy rights. You've got GDPR, which sets up a very rights-based, compliance-based approach. The question to our minds is, how do you actually give agency to individuals to effectively exercise control over their data? Not just checking a box saying, you know, don't use my data, but how do I actually control and manage it? And two things to say out here. I think the experiment that Apple is doing right now is certainly very interesting. But there are other models. There's a model, for example, in the India stack that was talked about by John, looking at the experience with the UPI in India. The Indian authorities have the concept of a data fiduciary, which would be a body that would basically manage the data of individuals and help give them effective control over consent management. I think another big topic when it comes to equity and privacy is the topic of protecting against exclusion. Manju talked made a presentation about her very cool paper about what you can do with all the data that is being gathered now by non-financial sector actors. But the flip side of that access to data is that the modeling can result in some very, adverse, depending upon your social preference functions, some very adverse outcomes, exclusion of people based on race or other types of characteristics that we may not think are appropriate. So that's the question for data governance. And then finally, on the finance piece, there's the big question about, well, given the inherent economies of platforms, would we see increased concentration and too big to fail on steroids and the trade-offs therein? I think there's a big question on cybersecurity. We all know that private institutions have significant incentives to protect their data, to protect their image. But the question raised by Kashyap and Winterfeld and others is, do the private incentives match with the social incentive given the externality that there is, that you don't internalize the impact of your data breach on the rest of the system? And there are, of course, big questions about topics like operational risk concentration as well, third-party cloud data services providers and whatnot. The point of this slide is coordination across an area which is very complex and very rich. And I think you saw elements of that as well in Xavier's presentation. Now, I'll just close by making the case for global coordination out here. Shanjing, if you allow me.
Yeah, 1 minute, if you don't mind.
Yep, no, I'll be very quick. Basically, the picture makes the point to you, it's a prop. It makes the point to you that cross-border trade in a loosely defined concept of data-driven services has basically exploded. It's become very, very large. So the global digital economy is very integrated, but given that there's increasing focus on the need to manage and regulate the digital data economy in different jurisdictions, there's an issue when different jurisdictions take different approaches to handling the question. So we have the FSB, we have the whole Basel project to ensure convergence or at least some coherence in terms of financial sector regulation. In the space of data, which I'd argue is a very important part of the need for regulatory framework going forward for finance the next decade, there is much less coordination. So the question really is, can we think about developing common principles? There's a list of principles out there on different topics. These are all relevant to finance, but more broadly as well. They have been talked about in different contexts. I think the European Union is doing some very interesting stuff on data portability and the interoperability question. But I think from our perspective, we would make the case that this is a very important area which needs a lot of thought. And we hope that forums like this will stimulate further discussion on it. So I'll stop there, Shanjin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this 10 very interesting and insightful comments. Hopefully my role as military police is over now. We can get some discussion, but our time is a bit pressed. I know we have a lot of talent in our audience. So if you want to share a brief comment, please raise your hand in Zoom. I think you will be popping to the top of my screen, and other speakers are welcome to react to each other's comments as well. But we do have a time constraint, so very much hope you can keep your remarks brief. So actually, let me go to Daryl first. Daryl, you already have a question in the chat room.
Oh yeah. Well, I was asking Xavier whether he's predicting that the fintech payment firms are going to destack banks, to put it briefly.
Okay.
Should I respond?
Sure.
Okay. Well, try to respond, which is not the same. So, not clear. Not clear. The reason I think is that banks, my impression is that they will not let payments go. They will not. So it's true that, as you said, banks can do it, but will not do it. It's true that
they're not doing it. They're not doing a good job of it so far.
Well, no. Well, it's there is mixed evidence. I think, for example, in Spain, they have constituted a payment service called Bizum, which has been tremendously successful, and it's an advanced, if you want, tech payment service, and they are thinking of extending this in Europe. So, I'm not so. I see mixed signals, more for the moment on your side, but it's not so clear. And my view is that they have so much at stake that, well, maybe some banks will succumb, but the more savvy ones, they will get it. And because if they don't get it, they will have an extremely hard time, and they will lose the deposit franchise in the end.
So this question can
just
certainly,
because of incentives, I think, tells me that it should that they should get their act together. And I see some indications that with some troubles and some maybe alliances and so on, so that they will, at least a subset of them will react.
This important question can certainly benefit from more research, including empirical research. Hannah Halaburda, can I invite you to share your thoughts, please?
Yes, thank you. So just to kind of Ralph, before I ask my question to Manju, to react to Daryl and Javier, there's a number of success stories like Swish in Sweden and Interact in Canada. And there is, what is missing is a success story of those payments, cross-border payments. This is the bigger issue. But I have a question to Manju about the digital footprint and the use of it for to substitute for other financial markets markers. And measures. I worry about the manipulability of it. So it seems like it is a great measure because people didn't know that capitalizing their names actually is going to affect the credibility of the loan, and they didn't know that shopping at 2 a.m. is going to make a difference. Wouldn't, like, once people know it, wouldn't it decrease the benefits of those measures?
Absolutely, right. And so definitely one of the issues is, as people get to know it, won't they game it? And so you have the Lucas critique there. And so first, that tells you that any credit scoring system based off digital footprints needs to be a dynamic system. I don't think it can be static because people probably will learn over time. Second, there are some nuances here, right? And you know, if we all know this, it's like in the old days when you'd go to a banker to get a loan, you know, you dress properly in a suit, you know, unless you're Zuckerberg, you wouldn't go in your pajamas, right? And so that you're trying to make an impression. So does it become the same thing that we all wear digital suits each time we go online? I mean, if so, that sort of has first order implications. The other issue is even if everyone gets to know it, you know, it's like, we all know how to be fit and healthy, right? Exercise and eat well. Half of America is overweight. And so part of the issue is that the people who are most addicted may be the least able to change their behavior, right? And so if it's an addiction, I get up at 2 a.m. and I you know, and I start fidgeting on my mobile and start doing impulse shopping. So the people who need to be educated and restrain their impulses, if you will, may actually have the hardest time doing it. But I think it's a good question. And this is why, you know, one of the questions I asked is, how durable is this for the long run? In some circumstances, it may be, in others, maybe not.
Thanks. Can I go to Lars Hansen for your thoughts, please? Lars.
Sure. I was asked to give some concluding thoughts, which is, of course, absolutely impossible with a session that's as ambitious as this one. I should say at the outset that I'm a consumer of research in this area and not a producer, so this will be an outsider's perspective. I found this session to be just very informative, and it really posed a variety of important and interesting questions and gives us all much to think about. Just in terms of things that stand out, and this has stood out over multiple conversations along similar topics as this, just the incredible implications for credit and resource allocation that come out of this fintech advances. There's been substantial reductions in transaction costs. It's altered the need for the role of financial intermediation. It's opened the door to broader participation. And part of the fascinating aspects of today's discussion is a reminder of this disparity between developing countries and developed countries. Developing countries, people talked about these technologies helping to leapfrog and opening things up very broadly, and kind of as Darryl would remind us in these many developed economies, including the U.S. economy, we have banks that are behaving like dinosaurs in some sense. They haven't been given the right incentives, and for some reason, central banks are just sitting around and watching this and I think that's an interesting, and I think that's a rather interesting phenomenon. I'll be be fascinated to see how this plays out going forward. I think that's really something to be watching, and something that I really hope that developed countries can address in the future. And yeah, maybe digital currencies by central banks will kind of sidestep the whole issue, and that seems to be where we're headed. Something that I would have liked to have known more about, and I'm sure people here know a lot about it. It's just that this is just my own ignorance, is kind of these implications for the underlying nature of the credit contracts as they play out over time, long-term versus short-term commitment, et cetera, as we go from these kind of old-style relationship banking to some of this credit arrangements on platforms. How does that think differently about the nature of the credit contracts? Data. So there's been lots of indications or discussions about data's become this incredibly rich new data can be used in very clever ways, and if you've been reminded that at least there's ways to encrypt them to at least produce partial protection for privacy. But I think I think that only goes part of the way to the concerns. I think there remains these kind of, from my standpoint, maybe big brother concerns. So we're going to have regulators engage in some form of regulation. In fact, I will come back to that subsequently. They will have access to this data. They are, to what extent do we want to trust them to share that, to preserve the confidentialities from other uses of say governments in order to police their citizens, including my own government here, which I had concerns about. I'm not sure exactly how to address that problem, but I think it's kind of sitting there in some people's minds. And these trust measures that John Frost mentioned could also ship easily with future experience, I would think. But of course, they were quite interesting. So let's now get back to this issue of regulation. So Xavier brought it up. Douglas Arner brought it up. Hasker talked about in the context of data policy. So let me just talk about the data policy part of this first. That there's a very nice slide here about the policy coordination being important and about a data policy framework. But as I look at that slide, it seems to me there's much to be filled out there, and filled out in hopefully coherent and meaningful ways. Vague mandates in general open the door to potentially counterproductive discretion. So it seems to me much more needs to be thought about these type of issues. They seem to be potentially very important. More generally, on regulation, kind of who and how do we regulate? What are the rules of the game here? Anytime we have a game between the private and public sector, often the private sector is kind of one step ahead. I think it's a huge challenge going forward. Maybe the digitalization that was brought up will simplify implementation in terms of regulation, and maybe it will help us to do this in sensible ways. There's references to systemic risk and new sources of it. I'm not even sure we yet understand all the old sources of systemic risk. It's been a challenge to figure out how to do that regulation in sensible ways, and there's been some unintended consequences of some of the regulations. Our academic knowledge about producing quantitative models to support systemic risk regulation remain fairly primitive and not as helpful as one might like. And now we're going to be putting on new potential sources of it. Again, I think kind of understanding really the nature of the systemic risk is going to be really important, and figuring out ways that we don't make regulators' task overly ambitious will also be important. But there seems to be a very important research question as to what is sensible ways to do this regulation, who should be regulated, and exactly how we should do it. I could go on, but to me, these are all very, very fascinating questions and very important topics for future research and discussion, and the ones that I hope to learn more about in the future.
Thank you very much, Lars, for your summary and for your questions. I'm sure if we add 2 more hours to our program, there will be still a lot of interesting things to discuss. But we already have learned a lot of interesting ideas, and I probably have added more research questions to our list of potential projects I have. Given that our Luohan Academy colleagues have already crossed into a new day, we have to perhaps conclude here. But before I do that, let me, on behalf of all the participants, let me thank Long Chen and the other Luohan Academy colleagues for organizing today's program. So let's give them a round of applause. And on behalf of Luohan Academy, let me thank all the speakers and participants for spending time at today's forum. Thank you very much. Have a good day or good evening. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, Sanjin. Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.